Welcome to All the Best, an interview series with UNL ORCA awardees, where UNL means University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and ORCA is the Outstanding Research and Creativities Award, which is UNL's top award. In Gerda Lerner's book, Why History Matters, she explains the life stories give meaning to the present and the future because we identify what is important to us. And she says, our stories show how we are interconnected in a particular time and place. As for this interview series, ORCA awardees have experiences that reach back more than a half a century, which will give us a personal view of how the best research emerged from UNL. It is my pleasure to introduce today's interviewee, Dr. Fred Luthans, University of George Holmes Distinguished Professor of Management, Emeritus. He was awarded the ORCA in 2008. After I provide a quick summary of his life and career, Fred would tell us about his time at UNL, starting with his award-winning research. Fred was born in Clinton, Iowa in 1939. He earned 3 degrees from the University of Iowa in Iowa City, located only a few miles from Clinton. His bachelor's was in mathematics in 1961, a master's of business administration in 62, and a PhD in management and psychology in 1965. After serving 2 years as a captain in the Army at West Point, where he taught psychology and leadership, he joined the University of Nebraska-Lincoln as an associate professor of management. He's had a remarkable career, but I'll only mention 3 major distinctions. His pioneering textbook, Organizational Behavior, is now in its 14th edition, and another one of his numerous books, International Management, is going into its 12th. Second, in 1986, he was elected by over 21,000 members across the world and served as the president of the Academy of Management. Third, in 2017, he was ranked in the top 1% for all fields with now, according to Google Scholar, over 190,000 citations based on his theory and research articles. He retired in 2015 and still lives in Lincoln with Kay, his wife of 63 years. With that, I want to welcome Fred to the interview.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate you doing this, Mark. I've looked at some of your previous work and I've been very impressed. Great. So I feel honored to be included in your group.
Well, I have enjoyed doing all these interviews. I've learned so much about people's lives. Let me jump into my favorite first question. What were your impressions about the UNL campus when you saw it for the first time? And what do you think about it today?
Okay. Well, I'll tell you, coming from West Point, that was an iconic place, as you know.
Yeah.
And, that's a tourist attraction, actually. So that was just dripping with history. So it's kind of unfair to compare what I felt when I came to Lincoln, Nebraska at the University of Nebraska. But I actually was mildly impressed because of the layout and especially my building, which was the original social science building with all those big columns in front, very stately place. And I really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed my home again with in between Sheldon and Love Library.
Yeah.
And at that time, there was a parking lot on the north edge of it. And then the chemistry building was off to the west a little bit, where you're housed. But anyway, my first impression was, favorable. And I mainly, I'll have to admit, though, was impressed with Lincoln's downtown. Mm-hmm. My wife did not come with me on this particular trip when I first came here to interview, but I knew she would like Hubble and Swanson and Miller and Bain, which was, very nice retail stores there in downtown Lincoln. So that impressed me. But then, the campus did also. And of course, I was used to Iowa, where we have a separate Iowa State University, where they have the ag and engineering mostly. And here we had the East Campus, which I always thought was pretty unique. Mm-hmm. And I was always impressed with the East Campus. But I generally was very favorably impressed.
And then how about today? What do you think about the campus today?
Well, I think, again, they've kept up with things. They turned our north parking lot, which was always kind of hard to get into because of the students walking through there. But the extension onto the Love Library to the north, and I think the Mueller Tower is cool.
Mhm.
And I still think it's very nice and very nicely laid out. So I like the Union very close to us. And then, of course, today, the College of Business has an $84 million building.
Yeah, which is gorgeous.
It's very nice. Hawks Hall, another Howard Hawk contribution to the campus.
Mhm.
And I, of course, did not teach there because I retired before it was open.
Mm.
But I've been back there since many times and actually had a part-time office there as well. So that was a nice addition.
Mm.
But frankly, I missed the old CBA building as well, with the big columns in front again and kind of a stately place. But of course, the new building is very nice, and
Yeah.
I attribute that to our dean at the time, Dondi Plowman, who is now president of the University of Tennessee.
Mhm.
And she actually raised that money from our alums.
Wow.
So
Wow.
no state money went into that 80 plus million dollar building. And it's very, very nice building. And she got all input from faculty on that and what they wanted, and really came out nice.
It's a spectacular atrium.
Yeah, the atrium is just awesome.
Yeah.
Kind of a waste of space too, but
No, but it's
is-
totally awesome in the true sense.
yes,
Right?
it is nice, and nice to hold our big meetings there and alumni meetings there and everything else.
Yeah.
So it's cool building for sure.
Mhm. All right, let's jump into your award-winning research. Tell us what you think you won it for and what you actually did, and then why was it important?
Yeah, my career was always positivity, but the first part of my career dealt with positive reinforcement and how that was applied to the workplace and to life. So I really took off on behavioral management that was being done over in the ed school with behavioral management in classrooms and in mental health with behavior modification. So I took what I started off doing work with the Nebraska mental health system, specifically through Dr. Robert Osborne, not Tom Osborne, who was my neighbor, by the way. So I knew very well. And Tom got his PhD, as you know, in ed psych.
Yeah.
But I worked with Robert Osborne, an MD psychiatrist, and we went around the mental health system of Nebraska. At Hastings had a facility, of course, out here at by Pioneers Park. They had a big facility out there when mental health was housed like that. And I went with him, kind of a scary plane rides that he drove. But we went around, and what was I doing? I was doing traditional management training, management by objectives, etc. But he asked me one day, why don't you start using behavior modification, which we're having a lot of success with our mental health clinical side of the house. So I said, gee, I don't know why we don't use that, because I had that background in my graduate work at the University of Iowa, which actually turned out like Albert Bandura, who is the biggest known psychologist, social psychologist that there is. He's always voted as the biggest name in the field and all that. I went through the same program he did at Iowa. He was 7 years before me, but anyway, my point is that I thought, why don't we use behavior modification in the workplace? Why don't we use that to manage people and organizations? So I kind of took off on that, and really started to apply Skinnerian operant conditioning, which of course is a radical behavior management, but still I thought the principles held. And he had a lot of scientific, background in what he was talking about. And I thought, why don't we take that positive reinforcement, not the use of punishment, but the use of positive reinforcement in the workplace to manage people? So I called that OB mod, or organizational behavior modification. So that's kind of my first career.
And that transition occurred when? How soon after you got
Pretty much right when I got here in 1967. I started doing this kind of work in the 70s for sure.
Okay.
And I had, the first behavioral management to the workplace in about my first article probably was 1971.
Okay.
So very early in the 70s, and that just took off for me. And I got a lot of, theory and research out of that, as well as a lot of studies and a lot of, frankly, not only with rigor of behavioral psychology, but also relevance. And I could do that with very easily, not just the use. I had studies that showed, for example, that compensation, of course, works as a contingent reinforcer, but so does recognition. So does just giving feedback. So that kind of really took off. And, I'm more or less championed non-financial incentives, because financial incentives, of course, was, part of the tradition of our field in human resource management. But I used a lot of, just non-financial reward and could show in research. And that's where I always made sure that I had the research to back up what I was saying, and did all the bells and whistles for appropriate methodology, etc., to get into the academic journals, not the Harvard Business Reviews, but the academic journals that had research backup to them. So I always made sure that I did that, and that came from my training at Iowa, where they, insisted that we do research, and basic research, not just, a flaky survey or something, but we did basic experimental research, for example. And that really took off. Okay, so then I got a lot of publications out of that, a lot of citations out of that. And that's kind of what I really had my reputation built on. Then what really took off was I did work with Gallup. So Don Clifton was a good friend of mine, and Don and his son Jim was also a real good friend of mine, socially as well as academically, and in their consulting business. And I was a senior scientist at Gallup when they held the first positive psychology summit. Where? Lincoln, Nebraska.
Oh, wow.
At the Gallup headquarters, just north of St. E's there, where they operated out of at the time. And we're talking now 1900, at the end of the century. So right at the turn of the century, early 2000, is when they held that first conference. And I sat there listening then to these gurus of positive psychology, primarily a guy by the name of Martin Seligman, who was a well-known psychologist in the traditional sense. And he laid it out for everybody and said, hey, let's look at things that people are doing right, not just what things are doing wrong. So he is known then as the father of positive psychology. And he was also, like me, a senior scientist with Gallup. And he gave the first summit then with all the founders of positive psychology. A guy by the name of Ed Diener out of the University of Illinois, and a guy by the name of, if you could pronounce this, then you're a true positive psychology. guy by the name of Csikszentmihalyi,
All right.
a real long, I think it's Czech, but anyway,
Yeah.
I know how to pronounce it at least. And I'm listening to these, but they're talking about mental health only. They're talking about clinical psychology. They're not talking about how you apply that in the workplace or in organizations. So I felt, wow,
Yeah.
I can do that.
Wow.
So the same model that I used for behavioral psychology,
Yeah.
I used to take positive psychology to the workplace using the same approach from the scientific beginnings. So anyway, by the time I got into the 80s, I had a ton of publications, not only in positive reinforcement, but also positive psychology applied to the workplace. So that just took off again around the world, I might add, because a lot of my colleagues kind of, that happiness stuff is kind of not scientific enough. So I made sure that when I started what I call positive organizational behavior, or POB, got to market this stuff. So what I called positive organizational behavior, number one, was based on theory and research. Number two, that it had valid measurement in the academic literature, not some, pokey,
Newsletter.
internet questionnaire.
Upload.
Yes. So we made sure that it had valid measurement with all the bells and whistles of reliability and validity. And then thirdly, that it was open to development. In other words, that it was state-like rather than trait-like. Personality psychologists, they say you peak out what your personality is at around age 30, give or take. But I said, it has to be open to development to anyone, that it's state-like rather than trait-like, that it can be developed, i.e. that you can manage it, you can develop it. And then fourthly, that it had impact that was desirable impact, i.e. performance, primarily because I am in the business school. I'm not in the psychology department. So we are interested in outcomes,
Hard-nosed businessman.
hard-nosed business results,
That's right.
productivity,
Yep.
profits, growth, etc. So I made sure that I set those criteria up for what I call positive organizational behavior. So in order to meet those criteria, we had search the literature and good graduate students who did the searches for me. And I came up with then the following positive psychology constructs that we were not necessarily doing ourselves in the field of business organizational behavior. So I came up with 4 constructs that met those criteria that I just listed. And that was hope. It was, had theory, it had research. A guy by the name of Rick Snyder at KU, at Kansas University, he had a 500-page book on hope theory. It wasn't just something off the top of his head. He had a measure, etc. So it met the criteria, hope. Secondly, that met my criteria was efficacy. And that's a Bandurian, i.e. Albert Bandura approach that I had personally done a lot of work with because of, again, my background at Iowa, the same program that Bandura came out of, as I said before. But that efficacy is confidence, basically. Now that's simplifying it, but it is self-efficacy. And that relates better to performance than any construct in psychology. If people have the confidence or what we call efficacy, then they have relationship with performance. There's tons of research on that, including that big one that you introduced in the introduction. We did a meta-analysis of efficacy relating to work-related performance. that's where we got that huge, reaction in the literature. Okay, so we have hope met the criteria, efficacy met the criteria, resilience met the criteria, which is very popular these days.
Yeah, but you were at it early.
I was at it early, but I drew again from positive psychology that had done a lot of work with resilience. There's a psychologist by the name of Ann Maston at the University of Minnesota who kind of specialized in her work in resilience or resiliency. So we got hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism. And optimism is actually one of Seligman's major constructs. Those 4 constructs in positive psychology that we hadn't been paying attention to in my field, we talk about motivation and, well, what is that? Well,
and how do you stimulate it?
And how do you, and how do you develop it and how do you measure it, etc. But those 4 had met my criteria. And wow, guess what the acronym comes out to be? Remember, I'm still in the business school.
EPIC?
This goes HERO, the hero within.
All right.
Oh, wow, everybody loved that. And, I like things like courage, for example, but there's really not a good measure of courage. There's not a good theory of courage.
Right.
I like
tested hard.
Yeah, exactly. And I like wisdom, but that's just really flaky. So those 4 are what met my scientific criteria to include into what I called then positive organizational behavior, or the hero within. And the hero within, of course, takes off with all the consultants and everybody else in the business world. So, I'm still in the business school. So anyway, that really has taken off. But I have the scientific backup to it. And I have the research that shows then it applies everywhere. Where? Business organizations, manufacturing, sure, but also service organizations. What else? Education. They love it. What else? Healthcare. They love it. So nowadays, I have more publications, citations in education, healthcare, of course, business organizations, and military. It applies everywhere because everybody now, and I can show then, the results are in my research. And of course, they have to cite me.
Right.
And that's where I get the almost 200,000 citations.
Oh, I don't know. That is totally one of the questions we have to answer today, and you just did. So that was
right.
Good. Yeah.
But the key there is that we have that backup to everything we do. And that appealed, of course, to the ORCA committee. And they can't argue with the citations.
And the ORCA was 2008. You started your textbook, Organizational Behavior and Evidence-Based Approach, in 1973.
Correct.
And this is the one with 14 editions.
Correct.
And on Google.
That's the first in my field of organizational behavior.
Okay.
That's the pioneering textbook.
Google Scholar gives it 21,600 citations.
Right.
Every search engine that you look up your book, right, it gives different numbers, and I don't know the actual numbers.
Right. But I use Google Scholar.
So, but it's saying that probably journal articles are citing your textbook. Is that right?
They are.
Yeah.
Because I, of course, have that slant to the textbook as well.
Yeah.
Even though it started in 73, I had a chapter on what I call OV-MOD before. And then positive stuff I put into my book in subsequent editions. So they cite that, and of course I am equated with the positive approach to management.
No, that sounds really good.
And I had a ton of great doctoral students that helped me along the way, of course.
Yeah. So let's go there.
Yeah.
Tell us about one or two or three of your early graduate students or visiting professors.
Yeah.
And what were their projects, and then what were their subsequent careers?
Yeah. Well, I think that I have to mention, again, my first one, the OB mod, was taken by one of my first doctoral students back in the early 70s. His name is Robert Kreitner, and he actually was a football player at UNO.
No, wow.
Yeah. But anyway, he came here then for his doctorate, and just really a great guy, and he believed in OB mod. He actually included it in his marriage vows.
Oh, wow.
I promised to positively reinforce my wife. I mean, that's how serious he was about it. And he was a great writer and a great researcher. And he ended up at Arizona State University, so, good university. And I have to mention him for the OB mod. Now, he wasn't part of my positive psychology movement, but, and then in the positive psychology, I have to mention two in particular. One is Carolyn Youssef, who is out of Egypt. She went to the American school in Cairo, and came here as a grad student then, and one of my doctoral students. And she just was a wonderful colleague and writer that was on a lot of the publications with me. And she ended up here at Bellevue. Why? Because her husband got a job up there as a PhD in engineering. So she ended up at Bellevue, and she has the only what would I call a foundation professorship at Bellevue has. I mean, she's got a ton of publications too.
Wow.
So anyway, I always kind of regret that she didn't get to a better school, but that's family was first with her.
Sure.
And so she's still there now. But again, the only, what I would call distinguished professor that Bellevue has.
So about an 800-pound gorilla.
That's right. That's right.
Bellevue.
That's right. They have that up there. So anyway, they have a lot of, I taught at Offutt Air Force Base too for many years anyway, up there at Bellevue. And then another just great grad student that I had was James Avey. And he came from Central Washington to Nebraska to get his PhD. And then again, because of family, he went back there. And he has a ton of publications, more than, 10 times more than anybody else at Central Washington.
Yeah.
So, but he's just was a real workhorse. And I was real lucky to have those grad students, plus a whole bunch of others, including, more recent ones that I've had in cohort that, ended up at Auburn and at Oregon State and at UNO actually. And they all are the best in their universities in terms of awards and stuff. But I was very lucky to have great doctoral students that felt they owed me.
No, it sounds like it was very successful.
Yeah.
So I want to get into what it's like to be a professor here and talk about impact. We're going to be looking at some of your most cited papers and books.
Yeah.
But before we do that, I want you to think back on the annual performance evaluations that you undoubtedly have to fill out when you were a professor. And every year we had to prove that we were still having an impact. So how does business administration define impact of a scholar?
Well, they're very concerned about rigor versus relevance. And the rigor part is make sure that I always did that, because sometimes that didn't happen in the business school, because they do have a mission of relevance. They do have a mission of, how do we affect practice? And I always thought we needed to do both. So like every other academic, we count citations.
Yeah.
And I have as you know, a ton, 190,000.
Yeah.
And as far as
I
I
think
could
that's the
tell,
most that I have of anybody that I've interviewed.
I'm sure. I look at this all the time. Many more than anybody else has.
Yeah.
So they look at that, and they also look at, again, what journals. We have a list of, academic journals, like 5 or 6 that seem kind of sometimes, oh, come on. I get more mileage out of maybe a lower ranked journal.
Yeah, exactly.
But we still, in order to get promotion and tenure, you had to have certain journals. Heads. And those journals are the ones with high impact factor. And like I said, Harvard Business Review doesn't count.
Right.
But Journal of Applied Psychology counts. The Academy of Management Journal counts. And we have a list of like I said, 5 or 6 of those in each of the fields of business. So, the accountants, for example, they're pretty hard-nosed.
I would believe that.
And they don't do much research though. And they don't hit the top journals. But like in management, we always, they have easier journals. No. Our impact factor is higher than other journals in other fields.
Yeah.
In marketing or in economics is a kind of that's the liberal arts major. A lot of schools, the econ department is in the College of Arts and Sciences.
Oh, wow.
And especially in smaller schools, but in big schools too. But they have their, academic rigor as well. But other than that, but we look at relevance and rigor. So it has to be relevant, because even these top journals, they require, what implications is this research for practice?
Yeah.
And we have to come up with that. So my stuff fits it very well because, again, one of my criteria is that it has to have impact. So that's how we evaluate.
Okay. So then let's look at some of these articles. And of course, the audience can only hear the titles of these if I read them. I want to start with 3 journal articles. Here's one from 1998, Self-Efficacy and Work-Related Performance, a meta-analysis, which you mentioned.
Right.
By Stajkovic.
Stajkovic, yeah.
Stajkovic. And that was
from Serbia.
Psychological Bulletin, 7,500 citations.
Right.
And so tell us what that one, remind us what that
Well, the first one, that meta-analysis, was actually his dissertation.
Oh, okay.
And it's still his lead article that he has at the University of Wisconsin. He's a full prof up there, one of my doctoral students. And then that second one was in personnel psychology. And what we did there is validate our measure, which I have my own measure of what we call PCQ, Psychological Capital Questionnaire, that has all the bells and whistles in this article, so that everybody who uses that questionnaire around the world, every week I get at least, several requests for permission to use it. And that has all the bells and whistles of reliability and validity. And it also then shows the impact on performance and job satisfaction. So it has all the empirical research that everybody needs when they do any research in this area, which, like I said, is taken off across the world.
Well, let me jump questions here. So did you ever copyright that, or was that of interest? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And we copyrighted that, and I have an online company called Mind Garden, which handles questionnaires.
Okay.
So I refer them to Mind Garden, but I don't charge them. Most of my colleagues who have an instrument like we have, questionnaire like we have, charge for it. We don't charge. Why? Because I want the research to get out.
Yeah.
But and especially this is popular overseas to get permission because the journals that like international people publish in usually have to show that they have, formal permission to use the instrument. Whereas here, they just use it without getting permission. Here, a lot of these guys, in my field at least, they use the questionnaire without getting permission, formal permission.
Yeah.
But the overseas journals require permission. So again, I spend a lot of my time these days just giving permission and sending them to Mind Garden, who then handles the mechanics of getting these getting this questionnaires out.
Yeah. All right, another paper, The Need for and Meaning of Positive Organizational Behavior. Sounds like your bread and butter there.
Yeah.
2002.
Yep.
In the Journal of Organizational Behavior, which sounds like an important one.
Right, exactly.
And over 7,000 citations.
Right.
So just again.
So that's kind of the founding article for the whole positive organizational behavior.
Yep.
And that's, got my foot in the door there before anybody else did. And that article then always is cited by people.
Yeah.
Because again, I then outlined based on that first conference in Gallup here, where I heard these positive psychologists talking about applying positive psychology to mental health, clinical applications. And I said, I'm going to take it. So I got it published, strategically in the literature in my field. And that 2002 then marks the beginning, and everybody acknowledges that because they can't argue with the citation.
Yeah. And so, but did that include research, or was that basically stating the approach?
What it was, yes.
Yeah.
And the theory behind
it.
it.
Real good description then.
Correct. Not data-based.
Right.
No.
Then we've got one from 2004, 2 years later. Unlocking the Mask, a look at the process by which authentic leaders impact follower attitudes and behaviors in the Leadership Quarterly, which again sounds like an important one.
Right.
And you've got 4 co-authors here.
Right.
5,300 citations.
Yeah, and that actually is the lead of that was Bruce Avolio.
Okay.
And Bruce was with us here at Nebraska as a colleague, not as a grad student. And he's very well known. He's the only guy I know that has more citations than I have. And he has a Center for Leadership at the University of Washington.
Oh.
In Seattle. And in fact, I just talked with him on the phone for a long time this past week. But anyway, so he took off with authentic leadership. And he and Bill Gardner, another colleague of mine here, they headed up our center, which was actually the Clifton Center for Leadership here, that Don Clifton gave the money for, a center that we had on authentic leadership. So they took off with that, and I was not the lead in that. I was the lead, and they got plenty of publications off of me, believe me, but more than I got off of them.
Sure.
But that particular one was one of the keys in this different approach to leadership.
But it sounds like some equal co-authors
Correct.
Contributing an
Correct.
important component
Correct.
to a process.
Correct.
Yeah. So then let's go to your most cited paper, Positive Psychological Capital, Measurement and Relationship with Performance and Satisfaction from 2007, Luthans, Avolio, Avey, and Norman in Personnel Psychology, which I'm not sure if that's how important that journal is,
Yeah,
but
no,
10,000 citations. Okay.
It is. It's one of the top journals in the field of my field.
Okay.
And that again gives the reliability and validity of our measure. And it also gives data that shows the relationship between psychological capital, or what we call PsyCap, 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 psychological capital. That relationship with these outcomes of performance satisfaction. And everybody that uses our instrument has to cite that for
You want to show it works.
exactly show it works and also prove the reliability and validity of the measure. with all the bells and whistles that everybody in, like Ed Syke would agree with. They use the same approach to validity that we used in this article of our measure. So that always is cited by anybody who does work in this. And like I said, it's just taken off across the world.
10,000 citations is absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
Right. And we already talked about your most cited book. Let's talk about the other one from 2006, Psychological Capital, Developing the Human Competitive Edge by Oxford University Press.
Yep.
You've got Luthans, Yusuf, and Avolio, and we've already talked about those other two people, but tell us about this book.
That particular book then outlines all the theory and background for psychological capital. So again, anybody that does work in this area, they have to cite that book too, because it's kind of the foundation. And then we did another one in 2015 that basically updated that.
Not a second edition, but a new book.
We say so, but it's really second edition.
Okay.
And OUP's treated it like a second edition.
Okay.
And they wanted us to do a third, but why? We already have that cited all the time, and there's not that much more to add.
Great.
Yeah.
So those are your amazing works. And which of your creative works do you remember the most? And why is it memorable if it's not one of the ones here? Or did we already hit the ones that you think of most fondly?
I think we hit them. Those are the ones that I like the best. But, obviously there are, I like those, the OB Mod ones too, the first ones. That's still, if I'm pragmatic about it, I think that still has big impact in how we treat people and organizations. And, again, we're going to get into the courses I taught, but the key is that people make a difference in organizations. But let's prove it. Well, I'm proving it.
All right, let's talk about other things that professors do. And so we edit books. We have society leadership, a whole range of things, set up conferences. So let's just talk about these two books. So how did it come about that you published these? How did you guys come together? These two textbooks.
Oh, the two textbooks?
Yeah.
Well, again, they were colleagues. One was a doctoral student of mine, Carolyn Yusuf at Bellevue, and the other one, Bruce Avolio, like I said, is really well known in the field of leadership. So I'm organizational behavior, he's leadership. But anyway, my point is that's how we came together. But my big deal is that
writing a book is not just you sit down and you say, okay, we're going to write a book. It's a serious endeavor.
Yeah, that 73 book that I had took me 4 years to do.
Okay.
And
exactly.
And then the additions, of course, that's easier.
It is easier.
But the original textbook, and I had nothing to go off of. I mean, my colleague Campbell McConnell had the biggest selling textbook of any field, including chemistry, including he had a Principles of Economics book. And I know what he had because he had the same publisher that I have, McGraw-Hill, which is a big-time college publisher. So he had the highest of any sales of any, I went to his, 10 million copies sold.
Wow.
I mean, he made millions off of that book. Anyway, I didn't have that. Why? Because he had a bigger market than I had.
Right.
But anyway, my point is, though, that I worked at that. I had discipline in my field of organizational behavior, and I had a wonderful wife that took care of our 4 kids, and I never missed one of their events ever. But I would write from 7 to 11 every night.
Okay.
At home.
Okay.
And I just churned it out. But I also became very well known in the profession because I had this involvement with our Academy of Management, which is all of the management professors in the world. And it's actually growing internationally more than it is domestically.
Mm.
And as you saw from my stuff, that I became president in 1986. And that was a big deal for me.
Well, it has to be. That's a huge organization.
Yeah. It's my field.
Yeah.
And to be elected president, that was a big deal for me. So I became very, involved with that, but I also came involved with editing.
Mm.
So I was the chief editor-in-chief of 3 journals.
Okay.
And that's kind of unheard of too in my field, to be editor of not just one journal, but 3 top journals.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had that. Now I got paid for that though. So that's another reason why I did it, because I made money.
Yeah.
But also I had the prestige of being the editor of Journal of World Business, Organizational Dynamics, and Leadership and Organizational Behavior.
Mm.
So I had those 3 journals, and that was time consuming.
Mm-hmm. 3 different publishers?
Actually, yes.
Okay.
And then I was also...
That's even more work then.
Yeah. I also was consulting editor for all management textbooks for McGraw-Hill.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that was a big job too.
Yeah.
But I still get some royalties off of that.
Wow. And any other society leadership activities? Besides being president, which I'm sure was amazing.
Well, of course, I had to do all the steps up to that.
Yeah.
I was president of the Midwest Academy of Management. I was, I had head in charge of the national program, et cetera, like that. Mm-hmm. So that kept me enough busy there. Mm-hmm. And no, I didn't do, I never did much locally, but I didn't have time.
Yeah. Great. Then, how is your research funded, and how did the funding organizations change during your time at UNL?
Yeah, so again, unlike the hard sciences, we don't get many grants over there in the business college.
Yeah.
I got one, very rare. So I got a big, believe it or not, Office of Naval Research, ONR.
Wow.
And I got
When was this?
This was in the 70s again.
Okay.
Early on.
Yeah.
And I got a $250,000 grant from ONR to do a observational study on basically the research question, what do managers really do? So I trained observers, both participant observers and grad students.
Are you sure you really want to know the answer to that question?
Right. Well, it came out like you would think. A lot of what we call networking. A lot of politicking. And that's how they got ahead. So I wanted to do observational research, which was very rare. But I had a PhD anthropologist who basically taught me how to do observational research. And so we did. And we got a book out of that called Real Managers. On what do managers really do.
Oh, wow.
And then we correlated the ones that do certain activities are more promoted faster than those who aren't. Mm. And as you would guess, those who were really good at networking, i.e. politicking, which we defined by observational behaviors, i.e., speaking up in meetings and stuff like that and playing the game, they were the ones that were promoted the fastest. So all of that was, a different type of research too. And that actually is a kind of another peg on my stool where we did this so-called real managers research with observational stuff, which was unheard of in my field.
Mm-hmm. So did you ever self-fund it, or is it just time, really? Time is all that you need.
Time and then, kind of contacts. Mm-hmm. So all my contacts in town here. So one of my big benefactors was always in my chair that I had was National Bank of Commerce. And they were very generous with me in terms of providing me subjects, etc. And then, of course, my work with Gallup. And frankly, I didn't get much of my basic research out of Gallup because between you and me, I don't want this, but that's still not the kind of basic research we like.
Sure. But those Gallup surveys, do they go out whenever you say, or is it part of a larger study?
Part of a larger study that they do.
Right.
And I'm just,
All right, we'll go on to the next one.
yeah.
So the techniques, how did you gather this data that you put into these papers? And then how did that change over time?
Yeah, okay. So mostly questionnaire surveys, which we don't particularly like, but so that's why I have that real manager study where we did direct observation through trained observers and participant observers, those who know what's going on when he's on the phone, etc. She's on the phone. And so, too many questionnaire surveys for sure, but that's how we gather data in my field. And again, we're not as scientific as they are in psychology, which I had a background in. So again, one of my criteria was that it had to have theory and research. And what kind of research? That tested through academic journals, not just off the top of the head. So we were very precise in that field of methodology and doing correct methodology and borrowing a lot from psychology, frankly.
All right, so the next question is about competitors, and it could be cooperative or it could be adversarial.
Yeah.
And if you're opening a new field, right, you're going to have all kinds of people who are going to jump in. So did anyone ever publish similar results at the same time, or?
Very similar results from the University of Michigan. They have their own center for what they call POS, Positive Organizational Scholarship. But like I said, I've got them on the citation. They came out very close, but a year or two after my published articles on this positive organizational behavior. They had positive organizational scholarship, they called it, POS. But we cooperated and respected each other. So when I came out of West Point, I interviewed at Columbia because I was taking some postdoc work at Columbia in New York City. I had an offer from Columbia. I had an offer from Michigan. So I knew them all up there. And, that was the prestige place, more so both Columbia and Michigan. But I came to Nebraska and I never regretted it. So mainly because it was closer to my home in Iowa.
Yeah, right.
So I didn't want to stay in New
5
York
hours
City.
away.
Yeah. New York City.
Yeah.
The parking was as much as I was going to make. And in Michigan, I didn't care for Ann Arbor to raise my kids. So I had many offers through the years to go, it's very rare that people stay with one university like I did.
Right.
But I never regretted it because mainly raising my kids here. Had a great school system here and all my kids are involved in school and now teachers. So in this picture here, almost all of them have to do with education.
All right. Controversies. Was your work ever involved in a controversy and how was it resolved?
Not really, except again, my colleagues in the U.S. still not really sold on this happiness stuff.
Oh, really?
You mean smile faces? No, I mean rigorous research methodology using reliability and validity measures, but they still have that kind of connotation. So we're not happiness folks. We're behavioral scientists.
Right.
So that's the only controversy ever. And I hope I've overcome that because, for example, I don't know if you know, emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
That's a biggie, and
Yeah.
very popular.
Yeah.
It's as popular as my stuff in positive psychology. But the difference is they don't have the research. They don't have the theory in the academic journals. They don't have the basic research backup. So I wanted to make sure I didn't get caught into that EI trap, emotional intelligence, which makes a lot of common sense, but everybody loves to pan it, including me. So I wanted to make sure that we didn't get into that, but that's carryover still affects the controversy a little bit and why we aren't as popular in the US as we are overseas. And I mean, in Asia, they love it.
Oh, yeah.
India, they love it.
Oh, yeah.
Europe, they love it.
Oh, yeah.
I was given an award, just most recent award I got was the Inspirational Person of the Year award in Germany. And, very nice trophy they gave me. The guy who got it for me, this award from a German Management Institute and magazine, the guy who got it before me climbed Mount Everest by himself. I didn't do something like that. He had no help. So he got the award the year before me.
That's inspiring. Okay.
Yeah, inspiring. So anyway.
Inspiring in business. Yeah.
Yeah, right. But my point is, they respect me because of the research.
Yeah.
And my doctoral students are very good.
Societies, what conferences did you attend regularly, and was there a meeting that was especially memorable?
Well, again, I attended all the Academy of Management meetings and somewhat what's called SIOP, Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology, SIOP. I went to some of those, but mostly all Academy of Management, which was all consuming for me. And of course, the memorable one when I was president. Yeah. And had the presidential suite at the Hilton in Chicago.
Ooh, nice.
with my wife.
Wow.
And sister actually was with me there too. So that's the memorable one.
That is.
And that was nice. And then of course, the same is true for all the Midwest meetings of the Academy of Management, where I was also president before I was president of the national. But that was enough for me.
All right, sabbaticals. Did you ever take one? And then if so, what did you do?
You know what? I'm not sure.
Oh.
Whether I did or not, I probably did, but I always taught a reduced load. So I would, including when I retired, I negotiated staying on for a year without the buy-in, or whatever they call it.
Right.
And I mostly did my work, and also I had book royalties coming in from the most popular book in my field. And also I did a lot of consulting with almost every organization of any size in Nebraska, as well as a long-time relationship with Walmart.
Oh, wow.
So I went down to Fayetteville, Arkansas at the Walton Institute and started their store manager leadership program.
Wow.
Had lunch with Sam Walton himself.
Oh, wow.
And we had lunch to outline what that program was going to look like. And I would go down then probably 4 or 5 times a month for several years.
Jeepers.
So
that's a lot of work.
That's a lot of work. And then I had a lot of, like I said, I did work with OPPD, Omaha Public Power District. I did work with Brunswick. I did work with all the companies in town and in Omaha and in Grand Island and in outstate. Holdridge, Becton Dickinson had a plant there. So, I do management programs. So I did a lot of that kind of work too. And in fact, I won the award for best places to work, contribution to the best places to work. I won the Junior Chamber of Commerce Award in Omaha for that.
Really?
Yeah. So
Well, that's got to be a special one.
oh yeah. And I did a lot of work with them.
Huh.
And still, not so much anymore, but even after I retired, I did a lot of work internationally. So I did work, for example, with the biggest lithium battery company in the world in Beijing, China. And that company, I looked up the head of it, and his name was, I forget his name, Wong. And he's a PhD in physics, and he had, I looked he's worth $24 billion.
Wow.
So
It's a lot of batteries.
yeah, it's a lot of lithium batteries. They have the world market on it.
Yeah.
They call him the battery king. But anyway, I did a lot of work all over the world. And one of my biggest gigs was with Song Lee, who you should interview for this.
He's coming up. Yep.
Yeah, good. He's great.
He's still in Lincoln?
Yeah, he is.
Okay.
He's good. My best buddy here in town.
Okay.
And he still plays golf. He's two months older than me, but he plays golf. I don't. But anyway, he set up a program that we had in the country of Albania under the American Agency for International Development, AID. And we went there when the walls came down in Berlin. About after that, Albania went from communism to democracy. And we went over there on a grant, millions of dollars for 12 years.
Oh.
And we went over there, I'm going to say at least 4 or 5 times a year.
Wow.
For a week at a time to teach them capitalism. And we used our books and then we would bring them back here too. And at the University of Tirana, the national university, which was a strategic coup for us because like the UN came and went and, but the university was there, is there, and, was there when we were there. So we had the stability of the university. And so we did that for literally 12 years. So I know Albania inside and out more than anybody.
Wow.
Song Lee knows more than me about it, but it was his projects. And then we had what was called the Pan-Pacific Conference, that we went to a Pacific Rim country for 35 years. So I'm a million miler, united too. Wow. And we would have these, in Asia, primarily Korea, but, I've been to China several times. I've been to Korea several times. We had a cooperative program with Bangkok University in Thailand. And all of that Pan-Pacific, that Song Lee was the founder of and president of for 35 years.
Wow.
So we had a contingent go over there. I was main one, with him. And Asians treat people very nicely. They respect age and academics. We fit the bill. So that was really cool. And then, of course, I did a lot of work in Europe with Albania, who consider themselves the poorest country in Europe. But we were there before the Peace Corps was even there.
Wow.
And they just welcomed us like conquering heroes.
Wow.
So we did a lot of that kind of work. And then every country in Europe and every country in Asia, and a lot of work in, especially Korea and China, because he's a Korean, and for example, his older brother was Secretary of Defense in Korea.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
That's a big deal in Korea, especially, more so than here. And his younger brother was number 2 at LG, which is the big conglomerate.
Yeah.
So anyway, all of that we did, and I did. a lot of that. But I never missed one of my kids' activities. Seriously.
So that was a nice summary of contributions other than the stuff
Yeah,
we talked about here.
exactly.
But then service, we also do stuff to the department in the university.
Always.
And what of those do you remember the most?
Well, I remember the most being on the graduate committee at the
Okay.
college level
Mhm.
and being on the distinguished professor committee at the university level.
Mhm.
So I chaired both of those for many years while I was here
Mhm.
and enjoyed both of them.
Mhm. Oh, that sounds really good. Which courses did you teach more often than others, and what are your thoughts about the importance of those courses?
Okay, so I had always an undergraduate required course using my text. and I'd always have a big auditorium in CVA over there, 210 students
Yeah, big. Yeah.
every semester.
Yeah.
And then I would teach a doctoral seminar. So I teach, 9-hour load, 6 in the fall and 3 in the spring.
Pretty good.
And I remember mostly that, just trying to convince these students in the business college that the human side is most important and showing them why with the research that I did. And so that was, that was good. And I think I got across, especially the MBA students who had a little business experience, because I didn't have answers always because of the complexity of the human being.
Mm-hmm.
But I did have convinced them that that was the most important. And of course, the MBAs who had some experience, they know that.
Yeah. No, my impression of MBAs is that it is people who have businesses
Correct.
and they are encountering
Correct.
things that they have no idea what to do,
Correct.
and they want to build a business,
Correct.
and it's all hard.
Correct.
So then they go back.
Right. And, accounting had answers, the debits equal the credits. I didn't have answers like that, except I had original research that I can show them.
Yeah.
And then, of course, PowerPoint just made it easy.
Sure.
So I did that. And of course,
What was the name of the course?
organizational behavior,
Okay.
both at the MBA level and at the undergraduate level.
Okay.
Required course
Okay.
for both.
All right, let's move on to your youth. Tell us about growing up in Clinton, Iowa.
Clinton, Iowa. I'll tell you.
That's a fairly big city.
Yeah, it's like 30,000.
Okay.
Yeah. It's on the Mississippi River.
Okay.
And I grew up on the Mississippi River. And we've, in fact, at Eastmont there, where we're at here, we had a river cruise one day over on the bus, get on the cruise ship with a little, small, went up an hour to Dubuque,
Mm.
came back the next day and went by our farm
Oh,
on the way. Clinton is in between Davenport and Dubuque.
Mm.
Anyway, for me growing up was all about sports. So we did baseball in the summer and basketball in the winter and track in the spring. And I was good track. I, placed at state meets and all that and won some big meets. And one of the things that they like me for here is that I was on the track team at the University of Iowa. I got a letterman.
Oh, is that what that is?
So they don't give a damn about my citations.
And I should say, we were just looking at his ring.
Yeah, exactly. That's what they're interested in, that I was a letterman at the University of Iowa. So once a Hawkeye, always a Hawkeye.
Yeah.
So when they played Nebraska, we went over there in the 70s when they played each other, and I thought, what am I going to go for here? Because I went to Hawkeye games all my whole life with my dad.
Mm.
And I had a great childhood. My dad was a grocerman, and he always said he was going to retire, and he did at 45.
Oh, wow.
45 years of age.
Cheapers.
But he made money during the Depression.
Mm.
Why? Because people still had to eat, so he had leverage with it. And he had the corner grocery store with meats and free delivery and credit.
Mm.
So he had people owing him money.
Yeah.
And they'd work it off. So they built our garage, they built our cabin on the Mississippi River.
Oh, wow.
So I had a great childhood, and we had a farm, so I know farm life at Princeton, Iowa, in between Clinton and Davenport, and I couldn't have asked for anything better. Was I academic? No. Did I take books home? Yes. Did I ever look at them? No. So I, always did stuff with my friends, and like I said, revolved around sports. And I played basketball, I played football, I played mostly a track guy.
So then how did you end up at University of Iowa in math?
Yeah.
Explain that one to me.
Yeah, but I ended up in math is because I couldn't make it in engineering. I had so many damn math courses already when I decided this isn't something I want to do. So I went from, I had like 12 hours of calculus, and I thought, well, geez, what does a math major require? Well, about 4 more courses, so that was it. So I ended up in those later courses turned out to be pretty much philosophy.
Right, absolutely.
Logic.
Yeah.
So I ended up took some business courses too, and then got the MBA. And then
right away,
I went 8 straight years at
How many mathematics majors become business?
Not many.
I wouldn't think so.
No, not many.
It does not sound like an overlap to me.
That's right. Not many. And I had trouble with chemistry too.
Oh, yeah.
No, anyway.
Well, what attracted you to an MBA?
Well, just because that was something that, I took a few courses at the undergraduate level in business just to see what it was like, and I liked that. And I had a mentor in my management course as an undergraduate who had the first textbook in principles of management. And he later came here as the head of our department of management. And so I lucked out there. Of course, he was my mentor at Iowa, my mentor, and also I had 7 articles with another mentor of mine at Iowa. As a doctoral student, I had 7 published articles before I graduated. Ooh,
wow.
That's why they wanted me at Columbia. That's why they wanted me at Michigan, because I already had the ground running, let alone my work that I did at West Point then, teaching. And I didn't have the pressure of publish or perish, because at West Point I didn't have that problem.
Right.
And I already had published.
When you went into the business courses, were you thinking about your dad's grocery business?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of.
I mean,
Sure.
you have experienced
He was an
it
entrepreneur.
firsthand. Yeah.
Yeah. And he was smart in that he got out of the corner grocery store business when the first supermarket came to town. And he would literally
That would
got
be
out
smart,
the year that they came in.
Oh, wow.
So he was smart, and always admire him. He's my hero. He's my dad. So, and he did very well.
And then a doctorate in management and psychology.
Right.
Is that a
So-
normal sort of a?
No,
No, okay.
what is normal is management and economics. Everybody used econ kind of as their basic, foundation.
Sure.
I found psychology more interesting than economics. So I took the Iowa psychology program along with my PhD in management in the business college. And Iowa had and has a very good psych department. Like I told you, Bandura's out of that department. And so I took that, and that's how I kind of got on the ground floor of my field of organizational behavior, the melding of management and psychology.
Right.
So that was a wise choice on my part.
Yeah.
So
Driven by interest.
yeah, driven by interest. And interest in the sense that, boy, I like the psych stuff and I like the management stuff. I didn't like the accounting stuff and I didn't like the marketing stuff. That was too hokey for me too. But I did like the rigor that I found in psychology. And like I said, my mentor in management, I just lucked out on. The 2 guys the one mentor I had was the previous president of the Academy of Management before me. And then my mentor that I had that had the first principles of management textbook, encouraged me and served as a role model for me here when he became chairman of the department. So I really lucked out there.
Yep, sounds like the Midwest.
Yeah,
right?
well, big time Midwest. Yeah.
Let's see. Tell us about your very first paper. How did it come about, and what's the author order?
Well, I'll tell you, that's reaching back.
I know.
But when I working with these guys that I just told you about, never forget, I got a call on Christmas Eve. Such and such paper is, we need to get that revised, by X date here. And my parents and my wife, what? On Christmas Eve? He's calling you? That's when we knew. And when I knew, that's what I liked to do.
You were hooked.
I was hooked. And whether I wanted to or not.
I know.
But my wife still talks about that. On Christmas Eve? You got to be kidding me.
Do you remember what it was about?
Actually, it was about it was about discrimination in employment.
Oh.
And whether the union contracts had those in there or not, which was, before its time in terms of diversity and ethics. But I had a textbook in social issues in business as well.
Oh, wow.
And one of my doctoral students here that I should have mentioned as well, just retired this time right now, this spring, was Gwen Combs. She's a African-American woman who has a lot of DEI stuff.
Sure.
Diversity, ethics, and inclusion. Equity and inclusion. But anyway, she just retired, and her husband was a political science professor. Michael Combs was his name. He's deceased. But anyway, that's what it was about, because I had an interest in that too, before it was popular.
Well, that's a good first paper.
Yeah, it was. It was.
And it was just you and your advisor.
Right.
Yeah. And who wrote the thing? Do you remember?
Well,
the whole thing?
No.
No.
But it's certainly
Collaboration.
Yeah, collaboration, okay. Sure.
In retrospect then, how far did your academic work diverge from your graduate work?
Actually, I think melded very nicely, especially with that psychology input that I had in my graduate work. And I had some big time professors from Iowa that, lasted my whole life in terms of influencing the way I thought and the way I did things and the research part of it. So that's what I would say there.
And then let's talk about the family. We know you're married and you had, 4 kids?
This is the most important thing right here to me, to that group right there.
Yeah. And so this is in what magazine?
In business.
Nebraska Business?
Yeah, Nebraska Business.
College of Business,
Yeah.
Nebraska Business Magazine.
Yeah.
The Luthans family establishes doctoral fellowship. And
right.
A picture of a lot of people.
Right. And those a lot of people are our group. And we just met again just a couple weeks ago, 25 of us.
So then when did you get married? And
got married.
Kids, how did that fit into the West Point thing?
Yeah, that marriage took place in 1963. And let's see, 1960. No, I'm sorry, 1960. Anyway, 63 years of marriage.
Okay,
so,
63 years of marriage.
Yeah. And my wife, I met at the University of Iowa. She was a freshman, I was a sophomore.
Okay.
And then she went off to Northern Colorado her junior year, graduated out there at Greeley. And then we got married and she taught school while I finished up my doctorate, which I graduated in 1965.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it was 1963 when we got married.
Mm-hmm.
And then she was a high school English teacher
Mm-hmm.
while I was finishing my doctorate at West Branch. Now here's a question for you. Who's from West Branch?
I don't know.
West Branch, Iowa.
I don't know.
You don't?
No.
Herbert Hoover.
Herbert Hoover. I still want to go to his library.
I was there when they dedicated it. And
It's on my list.
we lived just in his backyard, actually, in a small apartment on the alley that overlooked his property there at West Branch, a nice little house and blacksmith shop, and then the presidential library, which everybody came to when he died.
Yeah.
And we always said we wish we could have smart enough to make sandwiches and sell them, because they couldn't accommodate the thousands of people that were there. But anyway, that was fun time. So she taught it at first at Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and then moved to West Branch because that was closer to Iowa City where I was, and finished up there. And then she went with me, of course, to West Point, and there's a story in West Point too. So I got ROTC commission at the end of my undergraduate degree in 1961.
Okay.
But I just kept going, mainly because then I didn't have to go into the Army right away.
Sure.
So I didn't have to go to anything. But then as soon as I got my doctorate, I got my assignment. Where? Vietnam.
Oh.
So I looked at orders and I thought, oh my God, I don't want to go to Vietnam. So I went over to the Iowa Library, got the catalog for West Point because I knew I was going in the Army. And I looked at the courses and I checked off, I can teach this, 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 and this. I went to my ROTC commander, Colonel, and I said, why would I be assigned to Vietnam when I can teach these courses at West Point? He said, well, I'm a graduate of West Point. I'll see what I can do. He did.
Wow.
Got my orders changed. They had to send me through the infantry school first to give me a little polish to go to West Point. But I got my change of orders from Vietnam to West Point. And West Point was, of course, great.
Yeah.
We went, down to, we saw every show on Broadway. We went to the Carnegie Hall. We went to everything through the USO, all free.
Wow.
And went to all the football games. Bobby Knight was the basketball coach. And we had a wonderful time. The bad news was my cadets would come back in body bags.
Oh,
That was not fun.
wow.
So I'd have them in class, required course in psychology and required course in leadership. I'd have them in class and then they'd be assigned to Vietnam and come back in a body bag, a lot of them. And every single one of my cohort group at Fort Benning Infantry School, which I had to go through 9 weeks of course, every one of them went to Vietnam.
Oh, wow.
Except me.
Wow. Wow.
So I always tell my students through the years then that my education saved my life,
Right.
because a lot of those guys that I was with in infantry school got killed too.
Right.
So anyway,
So you had
That's
2
a good
years
story.
teaching at West Point,
Yeah.
and that's why they hired you as an associate professor,
correct,
because you had lots of teaching
correct. I had publications
Yeah.
and teaching
Did
experience.
they give you tenure too?
No,
Oh, okay.
but I got it like after a year
Oh, okay.
or two maybe.
Okay.
But I did get associate, and that's why I didn't go to Michigan too.
Right.
Well, I'll come here as associate professor. And
So before and after retirement, what did you do for relaxation and entertainment?
before and after, same thing. Husker sports.
Okay.
I go to all the games. Football, I never missed anything in the last 3 years. I don't go anymore. Too hard to get there and all.
Yeah.
I still get my tickets
Oh,
for my kids.
ah,
They all come to the games. And then my wife and I enjoy and go to men and women basketball and volleyball until I just got reseated last week.
oh,
Guess what? 17 rows up. Can't do it. My wife can't make the steps because of her heart, and mine too.
wow.
So that's where we're at. We've got reseated.
Yep, no, they really did a thing to their
They did.
fans on that
They
one.
did.
Don't know why.
And we started off over the Coliseum.
Yeah.
When Terry Pettis stood out in front and said, "Come on in with your football ticket free."
Oh, wow.
Now I had to pay even to get a ticket consideration.
Yeah, right.
So anyway, those are some side effects that I don't know if you want to, how much of that kind of stuff you want to put in there. Don't, but
It's all in there. All right, Fred, thank
Yeah,
you for
okay.
telling me your stories. I very
Okay.
much enjoyed hearing about your life and career.
well, thank you. And I really mean it. I appreciate that you're doing this. And the ones that I've seen so far is really good and really deserving.